And that's something that I'm sure we both do in our media trainings is you can never look into the crystal ball and know exactly what you're going to be asked. And that's why this bridging technique is so important. But you do need to think through, gee, if I'm talking about this particular topic, what questions am I likely to get? And also, what do I really not want to be asked? And why don't I want to be asked? Is it off topic? Is it controversial? I only have 3 minutes in this TV segment. I don't want to waste precious time on this. And so thinking through all of those things and just knowing you can't possibly have the answer to every single thing so that you can bridge back to what's most important for people to know is this.
Yeah, which goes with what you really want to be asked, and sometimes you're not. So you have to bring them back to your topic, even though it may not be exactly the answer to the question that they asked. Well, hey there. Welcome to Media Savvy, the podcast that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes to get noticed by media and become the go-to expert that they keep coming back to. I'll be sitting down with successful writers, producers, and entrepreneurs to learn the tools and tactics they use to build their reputation and in turn boost their business. I'm your host, Bonnie Taub-Dix, and I've been working with top-tier media outlets for more than 30 years, anywhere from traditional print publications to online and social platforms. And I'm sharing my nutrition guidance without gimmicks. But you don't have to be a dietitian for this podcast to speak to you. Through my one-to-one conversations, you'll learn how to build a strategy to get your name in the news and establish yourself as an authority in your field, no matter what the industry. With Media Savvy, I'm on a mission to inspire, motivate, and empower you to have the confidence and tools you need to shine in the spotlight. Are you ready? Let's get Media Savvy. Well, hi there. Welcome to another episode of the Media Savvy podcast. I'm Bonnie Taub-Dix, your host, and I am so excited for you to hear me speak with my guest today. I know you're going to pick up such great tips from her. So let me tell you a little bit about her, and then we'll get rolling. So Melissa Joy Dobbins is the CEO of Soundbites Incorporated, a food and nutrition communications business where she promotes sound science, smart nutrition, and of course, good food. An important focus of her business is training other dietitians on media presentation and other communication skills. Melissa is the host of the popular Soundbites podcast, which we'll be talking so much about coming up. And she's been doing that for more than 10 years, where she interviews experts on a variety of topics ranging from fad diets to farming, sharing evidence-based information, and she shares realistic solutions to how to help people enjoy their food with health in mind. You'll hear a lot more about her podcast coming up. She has received numerous awards, including the Media Excellence Award from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and Outstanding Nutrition Entrepreneur Award. A fun fact about Melissa that I just learned is that she even served as an expert witness on behalf of the federal government in an FTC trial of someone who was convicted of nutrition-related fraud. Well, that's a first for this podcast. Welcome to Media Savvy, Melissa. I'm so happy to chat with you today.
Hi, Bonnie. So good to see you. Thank you so much for having me on your show, and congratulations on your podcast. It's so exciting.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, you were an inspiration to me. Okay, so tell us. I know you're a published author, a speaker, and a podcaster, just to name a few of your roles. But how did you get started in working with media?
Yeah, it kind of just happened to me. I think a lot of people have sort of, different ways of getting into the media, but sometimes it's accidental. My media background is primarily live TV interviews in the Chicago market. So on the first day of my second job, I was an outpatient dietitian in a hospital in Chicago, and actually the suburbs. A TV station came to the hospital wanting to interview a dietitian about nutrition. And I had no formal training. I had no idea what I was doing, but I remembered thinking, if I don't say yes to this, who will they talk to? And I thought, well, I've got to know more about nutrition than the average Joe on the street. So I said yes, I did it. And then the next 5 years in that job, I didn't do any more TV, but I did a lot of print interviews. And then I transitioned I took a job as a supermarket dietitian in the major grocery chain in Chicago. And then I finally had some formal media training. And in that role, I was on TV every week. I did a lot of radio as well, which I much prefer, and print interviews. It was just a lot of media and other things. And, supermarket dietitians wear a lot of different hats. So it was a big job. And I never really loved it, but the more training I got, the more experience I got, the more I learned. And I always felt that it was really important that credible people have their voices out in the media. So after the supermarket job, I went to work for the Dairy Council, and that's where really I had the most excellent media training. I had crisis communications training, which is, add a whole other layer on top of those skills. And I served as a National Dairy Council spokesperson for several years. Then when I left there and started my own business in 2011, that's why I felt like it was so important to provide communications training for dietitians, because I didn't really have the opportunity other in those specific roles. I was also a state media rep, and then around that time when I started my own business, became an academy spokesperson. But most dietitians don't have access to media training. So how are we supposed to have a strong, credible voice out there if we're kind of just winging it?
Yeah, it's so funny. I didn't realize that we had so many similarities, because my first media experience was walking through a supermarket with a TV commentator while I worked at a hospital. And then I became a state representative, and then I became a spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So very similarly. But if you saw some of my first few interviews before I ever had any formal training, oh my gosh, my hair, my jewelry, my clothing with flowers on my blouses. I mean, seriously, the reason why I really am so passionate about media training now is because I really needed it. I mean, I think that it's great to just go out there, but it really is nice when you feel a little more polished. So that's,
you don't know what you don't know. And I think a big part of it, you'll probably agree, is yes, there's always skills, basic skills. Even like you and I, we can still learn how to improve our media skills, and we're media trainers. But I think a big part of that is confidence too. So when you have some of those skills and you have that confidence, you're more willing to put yourself out there.
It's true. It's true. That is really the foundation. Obviously, you need to know your stuff. But the foundation of confidence really is what stands out to me. Because then you really can speak on any platform, really any platform. Right. Anyway, your podcast is super successful. And what really makes it stand out is that it's rooted in science-based nutrition. And congrats, by the way, because you recently celebrated 1 million downloads. I can't even imagine that as a new podcaster. That's just incredible. So as a podcaster, I have a few questions here. What inspired you to create a platform dedicated to evidence-based information? And with so many nutrition podcasts out there, what do you think sets you apart? And how do you maintain audience loyalty in such an oversaturated market?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, the 1 million downloads was actually over a year ago. But when you've been doing something for 9 or 10 years, it does accumulate. So just project into the future. Hopefully it won't take you as many years, but it is impressive to some extent, but it's very doable. I'm actually more proud of the fact that over 30,000 free continuing education credits have come through my podcast. And I know, some of your listeners are dietitians. And that's something that, kind of like the podcast, I thought, well, I'll just try this out and see if it's something that I can work into my workflow that's not too painful and time consuming, but that adds value. So it's just been a fun journey. When I started my podcast, I started my first one in 2014 with another colleague. I didn't even know what podcasts were. We were actually looking to start a YouTube channel to focus on myths and misinformation in the news, but we couldn't come up with a good visual. And when I did a little bit of research on podcasts, I thought, hey, it's sort of like a radio show. We won't have to worry about food and props and things that don't really, lend themselves to the kind of conversations that we wanted to have. So that podcast only lasted about 6 months, and I just pivoted and said, well, I'm not done with this. I want to learn more. And I really wanted to interview other people. So that adds another layer of technology, as you can appreciate. And thankfully, the platforms and the technologies have improved greatly. It was really difficult back then. Even just having good audio quality was really a challenge. But I guess I would say, like, I follow the things that I find interesting. And I think being consistent and really striving for good quality content is all you can really do. And then the people who are, they like it, they keep following it. And I think that there's so many more nutrition related podcasts out there now, which is awesome. I'm so thrilled that more dietitians are out there, which, by the way, whether you're a dietitian or not, you don't have to have your own podcast to get into the podcast space. You can be a guest on other podcasts. And so I always encourage that as well. But yeah, I just think being consistent and focusing on good quality content you can't go wrong with that.
Yeah. And so how do you decide what trends or topics are worth covering on your podcast? I mean, which ones do you really see do very well and which ones kind of should be ignored?
Yeah. So, at a basic level, I just do the topics that I find interesting. If I see a great speaker at a conference and a new compelling topic, or maybe it's an old topic that kind of provides some different perspective and kind of that's a big part of what I like to do on my show is how do we think about things a little differently? And, frankly, like the traditional media and social media on top of it, they don't always cover the topics that we know and love or that are emerging in a way that satisfies us as health professionals. Mm-hmm. They might get it wrong or they're just scratching the surface and not really maybe adding to the confusion instead of clearing up some of the confusion. So that's what's nice about a podcast is it can be a longer form content where you can really dive into the science. So if I find a topic interesting and I think, well, if other people find it interesting, I'll see those downloads. So to your point, we can kind of look and see like which topics are bubbling up, how many more downloads. I would say in general, people are always interested in weight related topics. On my show, they're maybe not as interested in like infant or child topics. I still cover those. But maybe if somebody's got a more pediatric focused podcast, then people are expecting those types of content. So
Sure. You mentioned something that I actually had a question about. So how do you find your guests? Because I know that firsthand you love networking. I've seen you at so many events and it is the best way to learn about people by hearing someone speak or by just meeting someone during a coffee break. But I wondered if you ever just perhaps read a study that was interesting to you and that you reached out to the researcher to be on your show without even meeting them or knowing them first.
Yes, I've done all of those things. I think, if I see a good speaker, then I have a pretty good idea that they'll be a good guest and work in a very collaborative way with them. A lot of times I'm not the content expert and, we can talk about that if you want, like what it's like to be on the other side of the mic. It's a big transition from being the spokesperson and the content expert. If I see a good presenter, then I have a pretty good sense that they'll be a pretty good guest. And we have so many talented colleagues. Like my wish list is endless because there's so many great people out there doing wonderful things. And I love having a platform to provide for them to showcase their work, whether it's a new book or a program that they've created or like research. But I have reached out to people, back in the day when Twitter was wonderful. I met a lot of people that way. So just anything that kind of like strikes my interest or meeting people through other people, like you said, networking.
Yeah, I think the important thing is just taking a shot and reaching out. When I got my first column in a newspaper, in those days, of course, you picked up the phone and you called someone. And I called this reporter who we just struck a great conversation. And then she kept calling me for quotes. And then she came to see me as a client. And then she gave me my own column in the newspaper. Yeah. So, you just never know. So I think that the key point here is just don't be afraid to reach out because what's the worst that'll happen? So don't be a nudge and, send a million emails, texts or whatever over and over again. But it is worth trying to reach out because you never know where that goes.
Yeah. There was one guest in particular, Dr. Kari Nixon. I found her. She wrote a blog about food shaming. So I connected with her through somebody else that I was just an acquaintance. And I kept reaching out to her through Twitter saying, you would be a great guest for my show. And she kept saying, I don't really know anything about nutrition. Surely you don't want me. And I kept pursuing her and explaining why she would be such a great guest. And I did eventually have her on, and she was amazing. But sometimes you do need to kind of explain what your interest is and what you think they could speak to. And that's also why I didn't do this in the beginning, but now I make sure I do it with every episode, is that I have a pre-interview call with my guest to get to know each other, to kind of talk through what my process is, how collaborative it is. And they're the content expert. So I want them to tell me, these are the things that the media is getting wrong. These are the things that people still don't quite get about this topic. Because as you know, as a spokesperson, the media, the host of the TV show or the radio station or whatever, they would just ask you random questions, and it was your job to bridge back, or I know you like the term pivot, to what's most important. Well, I don't want my guests to constantly have to do that. I want us to kind of be on the same page at the start of the conversation.
Yeah. Do you send your guests questions ahead of time?
I don't. I have like a guest information form that provides them with more information about the show, but also allows them to send me information like headshot, bio, things like that. But, regarding the topic, I'm like, what are the 3 most important things about this topic? What are some resources that I could review ahead of time? Be thinking about some bottom line takeaways for the listeners. And then from that, then we have our conversation, and I kind of put together sort of a rough outline, but it's not like, here's the question and here's your answer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, again, both of us have been on both sides of the microphone. And I kind of like to get questions ahead of time just because I like to know where they're going. But there's also so much room for spontaneity, which I think always makes a better interview. And I know that, for TV, lots of times they don't want to provide questions ahead of time. So what I do, and I know I've spoken about this before and I've written about it, is that I ask myself ahead of time the 5 worst questions I could possibly get asked, so that this way I could feel a little bit better about, what if they ask me this question and I have the answers ready.
Absolutely. It's one of the most important things that I cover in my media trainings and I talk about all the time is handling questions. Yes, we want to be concise. We want to be compelling. We don't want to just talk about facts and research. We really want to bring those things to life and organizing your information in a way that flows. And, you've got some, key points and hopefully a call to action, but handling questions is like, that's the secret to, I think, an excellent interview.
Yeah, I agree. And yet, if you listen to all the talk shows on Saturday mornings and a lot of the news shows, these politicians are not answering questions. They're just like, what? They just go right to the pivot and that's it. And it seems to be
there's no
acceptable.
Transition. Yeah.
Well, there's no transition. They just say what they want to say. I wanted to ask you something. You obviously emphasize the importance of science communication on your podcast and in general with everything you do. But some scientists are so sciencey, they might be difficult for your audience to relate to. So in these discovery calls, is that where you use your strategies to kind of simplify complex science for your audience without sacrificing accuracy? Is that where you have that conversation ahead of time?
It's a few things, I think. It's a mixture of things. One is I've actually been really pleasantly surprised that a lot of the science people that I have on, researchers, they are used to speaking to 2 different audiences. And in my show, it's a mixture of dietitians and other health professionals and the general public, which in the beginning I thought, well, should I niche down and just, focus on dietitians? But I didn't want to alienate, the general public and people that might be interested in this more sciencey information. I do get into a lot of science. So I think one of the things is, like if in that pre-interview call, if there's terms that maybe I'm not familiar with, I'll just kind of highlight, this is something maybe we want to explain. And I'm not shy about doing that during the interview. I pride myself on really letting my guests know this is, a safe space. Like, this is not a confrontational interview. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I want you to get in your zone, feel comfortable. But if you say something that I'm a little confused about or that I think needs a little bit more explanation, then I'll just say, hey, well, can you explain that a little bit further? And they're usually very happy to do that, especially because they know that might be coming and that it's just going to help the end user. And, I think as dietitians, as educators, I think we're actually pretty good at like not using technical jargon and things like that. So I haven't come up with, haven't come up against any real issues. There have been a couple of guests that I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not even following this, so again, I just say, okay, I've had to kind of embrace the curiosity and that I'm not the content expert and that people won't think that I'm stupid if I don't know, because if I don't know, the listeners might not know. So, it's kind of like if you're in a conference and you're like, I'm kind of afraid to ask this question because it might sound stupid. There might be other people wondering the same thing. So,
yeah, well, I think that asking for clarification really may not even be for your benefit. It may be a good question to ask just for your listeners.
right.
Even if you do understand something and someone may not be at your level of understanding. So asking, could you explain this a little further or clarify it is a great thing for your listeners. So I think that makes you a good podcaster. And speaking of confusing information or misinformation, we know that one place where that spreads like wildfire is on social media. So what roles do you think dietitians and nutrition communicators in particular play in combating these false narratives? Like, how can they be more effective in getting their messages out? And this, of course, goes for any professionals that are in media. But what do you think in particular?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, what I learned in crisis communications training is, and really that field has evolved. The days are long gone where we're just reacting to information. We've got to proactively put credible information out there. And so I think sometimes dietitians feel like, well, people know they're not getting enough fruits and vegetables, and they hear this all the time, is it important for me to keep stating how to do this? And I say, yes, it's always important to keep putting out credible information. Then when something comes up that's negative or misinformation, you're not just reacting to it. You've been more proactive. So when somebody hears something and they go searching online for what the answer is, they won't just see the negative information. They'll see all of this positive, credible information. And I think the other thing that I learned recently is, whether you're a health professional or in some other form of business, is really establishing your credentials right off the bat. Even if it's like a reel on Instagram or TikTok or something, is saying right off the bat, my name, I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist, I'm a certified diabetes educator, whatever your credibility is stating that out there. And that will maybe make people not scroll past and say, oh, this is why I should listen to this person.
Yeah, you said something that made me think about something I hadn't thought about in years. But when I was a spokesperson, I remember that one of the media trainers came to us and he trained many politicians. And he said that they had a whole manual on what would happen if in New York City there was a terrorist attack. And this was way before 9/11. So a lot of the politicians already knew things that they were going to say to comfort people and to let people know what was going to happen before, before this ever happened. So I think that for me, I know what I sometimes do. If there's some sort of nutrition news that I see on TV, sometimes I'll kind of formulate some sound bites in my head, or I may want to write something about it to be prepared ahead of time, because it used to be that, TV used to call me all the time for, hey, could you come on and speak about this? Or a reporter might ask me now to give some quotes on a topic. So it's really good to be aware of what's happening in the news and think about how you would formulate answers about that topic.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when I was on live TV, I had to pay more attention to what was going on in the news because you could get a question related to it. I remember kind of a funny example. I used to do a lot of like Super Bowl segments and, football season type things. And one time the anchor asked me who I was rooting for. I didn't even know who was in the Super Bowl. I was like, I can't tell you because it's a secret. Just like, I don't even know who's playing.
Yeah, well, yeah, that prepared is hard to be, but you can't anticipate everything. You
Yeah,
could
yeah.
just
Well, and
always
that's
say, yeah, you can always say, well, I'm not saying.
no, I'm rooting for the underdog. I don't know. Yeah, but that reminds me of what you were saying about, handling questions and kind of anticipating what you might be asked. And that's something that I'm sure we both do in our media trainings is you can never like look into the crystal ball and know exactly what you're going to be asked. And that's why this bridging technique is so important. But you do need to think through, gee, if I'm talking about this particular topic, what questions am I likely to get? And also, what do I really not want to be asked? And why don't I want to be asked? Is it off topic? Is it controversial? I only have 3 minutes on this TV segment. I don't want to waste precious time on this. And so thinking through all of those things and just knowing you can't possibly have the answer to every single thing so that you can bridge back to what's most important for people to know is this.
Yeah, which goes with what you really want to be asked, and sometimes you're not. So you have to bring them back to your topic, even though it may not be exactly the answer to the question that they asked. So yeah,
Right.
this is my favorite part and most challenging. So I know that you also coach groups. And when you're working with groups, I'm just curious about what you think are some of the biggest challenges that you notice that professionals face when trying to communicate effectively. And how do you help them overcome these obstacles?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. We already talked about confidence. I think that's one of the most important factors that I see. And just, helping learn those skills gives them that confidence. And just that I'm very encouraging in my trainings. I'm like, we need your voice out there. This is something that you can do. You can just build these skills and practice them. I think that that's another big piece is that people think, oh, if I was good at this, I could just think on my feet. I'm like, no, it's really about preparation and practice. And when they hear that, they're like, oh, well, I could do that. I just have to put a little bit of time in and it'll get better over time. The more I do it, the more familiar I'll become with it. I
Yeah.
also think being concise. I think science people, it's hard for us to just like boil it down and be concise. So that's a process that I've struggled with that, I just keep trying to tell people, like whether it's an hour presentation or a 3-minute video, you can't give people everything they need to know about that particular topic. So you've got to think about what's most important, those 3 key points, what's most important for them to know to get started. And, like if I'm a diabetes expert, so if I'm talking about diabetes, it could be a million different things, but maybe it has to do with holidays or a specific holiday. Maybe it has to do with type 1 versus type 2. So you're just really kind of, who are you talking to and what are the messages that's most important for them? And I also think that people tend to forget about that call to action. If we're sitting down with a patient one-on-one, we work with them to set goals for them to work on. But when we're communicating to the masses, oftentimes we're giving them information. So I always say, we're not in the business of just making people smarter about nutrition. We're hopefully helping bring them to action. And so trying to come up with an inspirational call to action, something that they can do is really important.
Very, very important. And I think, when you're talking to groups, especially executives, I know it was always important or really a surprise to me when I would try to teach executives about communication. And yet they had these high powered positions, but they really didn't know about communication skills, like simple, basic communication skills. So I think that, that's just another one of those things where being as clear and concise as possible sometimes gets much more of an impact than giving a whole long dissertation.
Absolutely.
And when you're preparing for interviews where you face some pushback or some challenging situations, what kind of advice could you give? I mean, besides the pivot, of course. I mean, I'm sure that you've been in many sticky situations. What kind of advice could you give to professionals?
Yes, my first national TV segment was a crisis communications segment. And I was like, why am I in this hot seat? Or, when I was an expert witness being grilled by the cross-examined or not, I wasn't being cross-examined. I don't know, being grilled by the, defense. I think, other than the pivoting, the bridging that we've talked about, which is so, so important and really gives you a lot of confidence. I think is just, taking a step back and taking the bigger picture and not getting too worried about getting into those weeds. I think some of those questions can just get really specific or detailed. And what really matters is taking a step back and kind of getting perspective. So there's a lot of ways, regardless of the topic, you can say again, like, wait, what's most important here? Let's not get into the weeds.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, as you said, being prepared ahead of time. If you expect yourself to think on your feet, that's really asking a lot. And that's a huge amount of pressure. Yeah. But I think if you're prepared ahead of time with those, especially 3 important messages you have to get out, and especially, as you know, when you work with a brand, that is the most important thing, is to make sure you say their 3 most important messages. Otherwise, you didn't accomplish your goal, even though you may have had a great interview.
Yeah. I think when you think about, like, I say, don't fall into the Q&A trap. Because, like, if we're just talking to a friend or a patient, there is a lot of Q&A. But with a media interview, you really want it to be organized so that, it's the difference between like a good interview and a great interview is if you've got your information organized and packaged up in a way that is compelling, it'll be more memorable and easier for your audience to put it into action. So I remind myself, this isn't just, some fancy strategies that, you can just build your skills on. The purpose is for your end user to get the most out of it. So a lot of this goes back to what's going to be most helpful for people. Mm-hmm. Not do I know the exact answer to this random question, but what will be most helpful and meaningful for people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and relatable. Yeah. I heard you speak at the recent Food and Nutrition Conference and Expo, and you talked about the truth in advertising and the impact of misleading claims that are sometimes made by food companies and even by health professionals. So could you just touch upon the importance of the code of ethics related to communications and what our listeners need to know about FTC, which is Federal Trade Commission guidelines, including some new guidelines. And this is especially when you're working with the media and especially when it comes to disclosing, which I know you and I see that so many people still don't do when they're working with brands.
Yes. So I co-presented with an attorney, and our colleague Shelley Johnson was the moderator, which was great because she recently got her degree, her master's of jurisprudence in food law, which I think is amazing. So I learned a lot. One of the reasons I was excited to be a part of that presentation is that I get to learn more. And so basically in our profession, we have a code of ethics. And, that seems kind of boring, basic, whatever. But a lot of the principles in the code of ethics do relate to communications. So it's things like obviously being evidence-based, providing accurate information, but it also gets into like refraining from saying anything that's fraudulent or misleading. And so when it comes to we kind of just have to fact check ourselves all the time, even something like health claims, like nutrient content claims. If you're saying something's an excellent source of something or a good source of something, I think being a supermarket dietitian helped me with some of that. And I know your book is on, reading labels and stuff. So you know a lot more about these like regulatory claims. And I think that can lend itself to like, I have to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate. So I was very accustomed to the 8 years that I worked with the Dairy Council, like you have to say things accurately and not misleading. And so I think that is just important for all dietitians and health professionals to just have in mind. And then when it comes to the FTC guidelines and disclosure, I mean, this has changed like so much over my career. When I was a supermarket dietitian and first starting to do a lot of TV segments and working with different brands, I didn't have to disclose anything. It was very different back then. And now, the whole point is for the audience, the consumer, to be very aware of any potential bias or, conflict of interest. And so the newer updated FTC guidelines, which was about a year ago, well, it was, June, July of 2023, those guidelines that were updated just wanted to make sure that we're being more clear and conspicuous with our disclosure. So not just saying hashtag ad or, this content is sponsored and burying it down in the copy is saying who the sponsor is, and also putting the disclosure on the visual properties. So if it's a photo, it's got to be on the image. If it's a video, it's got to be on the video. So those are just some of the main takeaways.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's really important. And a lot of this is because of transparency. Just letting the consumer know, and they could totally, believe everything you're saying. That's fine, but they need to have the truth in what's behind it.
Yes, it's all about transparency. Yes, and making sure that the audience knows any potential disclosures that are necessary.
Yeah, I remember when none of that really made a difference. It just wasn't even something that was popular, then it wasn't being used then. I mean, we have seen so many things change, and who knows what the future of nutrition communications will even bring with new technologies, AI. What do you think is going to be happening in our changing media landscape? And what should professionals do to adapt, to stay relevant and to stay impactful and to, I'll add, stay transparent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little daunting to stay up with the changing guidelines, and I don't have an easy answer for that. But I do think it's important to just, be very well networked with our colleagues and share updates and information as we see them. Obviously, communication opportunities, social media platforms, there's just, by the time this episode releases, there might be a new platform. There's just going to continually evolve. And I don't think we need to be on every single platform or do every single type of communication, but I do encourage people to try on new things and see what they like. They might I didn't know I would love podcasting as much as I did. And I know you didn't think so either. I think, go out of your comfort zone a little bit, try new things, and then just make sure you get your voice out there somehow. That's what's most important.
I think you had such a strong message there about how you don't have to do everything. And I think that so many people feel that pressure. And I know there's something new I've heard of, Blue Sky. And right away I said to myself, no.
I signed up yesterday.
You did? Oh, no.
I don't know how active I'll be on it. I did that because I used to love Twitter, and every platform has a different personality and a different characteristics. And I don't love Instagram. I mean, it's all right. And I'm not going to do TikTok. That's my thing. I'm not going to do TikTok. That my audience isn't there. So I just thought, well, if Blue Sky might be what Twitter used to be, I'll give it a try. And Threads, I've been enjoying reading it. I don't know how much energy I'll put into it, but I'm willing to give it a try. So
yeah, well, maybe I'll see you there, but I'm not committing.
If you liked Twitter, you might want to check it out.
I used to love Twitter. Twitter, and Twitter was actually very lucrative for me because I used to do a lot of Twitter parties with brands that I worked with. And I love those Twitter parties. For an hour, you're just, engaging, and it was wonderful to see. And I used to do Twitter parties with Everyday Health. It was just great. But I actually even just took X off my business card this year when I had new business cards made. So I'm kind of done with that, but we'll see what the future brings. All right. So I have two more questions to ask you that I ask all of my guests. One is, if you had a chance to send a message to your younger self, what would that message be?
Okay. So I thought about this because I know you asked this for all of your guests. And I think what it would be is, I moved around a lot growing up. I lived in 6 different states by the time I was in 2nd grade. I went to 3 different high schools. I went to 2 different undergraduate colleges. And it was a lot. And always being the new girl, always having to put yourself out there. It just was hard. And what I would say to myself is that experience will actually work to your benefit, because at the end of the day, it's all about people and relationships. And I was kind of continually forced to, reach out and build new relationships. And even though it was hard at the time, I do think it has made me who I am and valuing people and relationships.
Wow, that's interesting. I never knew that about you. That's tough, especially in the later years, moving in high school. That's really tough. You have to have a lot of confidence in those situations.
I did not have confidence, but I survived. And looking back, I just, like I said, I think it made me who I am today. So,
wow.
It also made me really more inclusive of other people. I think, and you and I have talked about this a lot because we're friends, and we want to be inclusive of others, and we want to help others. And I think that was also part of the result of all of that early life I had.
Wow, so interesting. Well, speaking of helping others, my next question is, if you could offer one piece of advice to someone considering starting a podcast, what would be your favorite tip, and what could set them on the right path?
Well, I would say just kind of follow your heart or follow your gut, whichever resonates with you. Do the things that are interesting to you. There's, as you know, Bonnie, starting a podcast, there's a whole laundry list of things you're supposed to do. You can't do it all at once, just one at a time. And yeah, don't get too wrapped up in a lot of the rules. I'm a rule follower, but I want to tell people, like with podcasts, you can kind of just do your own thing, do what works for you, and just keep going. Be consistent. If you like it, if you don't like it, stop, do something else. But I do encourage people to give it a try.
Yeah. And I think that, as you said before, being a guest several times on a podcast could really give you a little bit of a clue about whether you even like this form of communication. So I think that was also a really good tip. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to follow Melissa Dobbins, could you please tell us where people could find you?
Sure, absolutely. My website is soundbitesrd.com. And of course, all of my podcast information is there, my social media handles, but I'm on Instagram at MelissaJoyRD, and now still on Twitter, but I haven't posted for over a year. I'm not going to call it X. And now I'm on Blue Sky, which is also at MelissaJoyRD. And my podcast is Sound Bites, a nutrition podcast with Melissa Joy Dobbins. And I encourage people to just check it out and drop me a message on social media or shoot me an email.
Thank you so much. And it's based on science, but not too sciencey. I will tell you that.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a wrap on today's episode of Media Savvy. And a huge thanks to Melissa Dobbins for giving us an inside look into her media world and for sharing some of her game-changing insights. And friends, if today's conversation resonated with you, I would love it if you would subscribe to this show, leave a quick review, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. So this is Bonnie reminding you that you don't need years of experience to make a meaningful impact. The show is for anyone ready to connect with media, but also to be media. So let's connect on Instagram at BTD Media. I'd love to hear your burning questions or your biggest wins. And by the way, you're looking very media savvy today. So until next time, signing off.